Lucia Reyes never thought of herself as someone good at math. Numbers were just part of life, like breathing or walking. Nothing special. Growing up in Pine Creek, a town so small it barely showed up on maps, she'd been the girl who helped her dad with the family store receipts and made sure the change was right when customers paid. But that was just everyday stuff, not what real mathematicians did. Now at 34, Lucia stood outside the brick building of Westlake Community College, gripping her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles turned white. Around her, students half her age chatted and laughed, seeming perfectly at home. They belonged here. She wasn't so sure she did. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. The same words she'd repeated like a prayer since mailing in her application 3 months ago. After 16 years of working at the local supermarket, starting as a cashier and working up to shift manager, she was finally chasing the dream she'd put on hold when her mom got sick during her senior year of high school engineering. The words still felt strange in her mouth, like a food she wasn't sure she liked yet. But she'd always been fascinated by how things worked, taking apart old radios and clocks as a kid, fixing the store's freezer units when they broke down. "You've got a mind for solving problems," her Uncle Pete always said. Maybe he was right. The hallway smelled like floor cleaner and new textbooks. Room 143, Intermediate Mathematics. Lucia checked her schedule again, though she'd memorized it days ago. She took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Inside, about 20 students were already seated. Most looked barely out of high school, scrolling through phones or talking in small groups. A few older students sat scattered around, not as old as her, but at least in their 20s. Lucia felt a small relief. At least she wouldn't be completely alone. She chose a seat in the middle row, not hiding in the back, but not drawing attention up front either. Perfect for someone who wanted to blend in while still seeing the board clearly. A young man in pressed khakis was setting up a laptop at the teacher's desk. Professor Winters, according to her schedule. He looked younger than she expected, maybe early 40s. With rimless glasses and the neat appearance of someone who color-coded his sock drawer. The clock hit 9 a.m., and Professor Winters cleared his throat. The chattering died down. "Good morning. Welcome to Mathematics 201. I'm Professor Daniel Winters." His voice carried the precise tone of someone who measured words carefully before speaking them. "Before we dive into the syllabus, I'd like to get to know who's in the room. We'll go around and you'll introduce yourselves, name, background, and why you're taking this course." Lucia's stomach tightened. She hated this part. What would these kids think when they heard a supermarket worker was trying to become an engineer? The introductions began with a blonde girl in the front row. "I'm Zoe. I just graduated from Westlake Prep, and I'm taking this as part of my pre-med requirements." Next, a young man with carefully styled hair. "Tyler, computer science major. Need this for my program." One by one, the students shared their stories. Most were direct paths, high school to college, following the neat straight line society had mapped out for them. When the introductions reached her row, Lucia took a small breath and sat up straighter. "I'm Lucia Reyes," she began, her voice steadier than she felt. "I work at Pine Creek Market, have been there since high school. I'm starting the engineering program, so I need to catch up on my math." She noticed a few students exchange glances. A girl with sleek dark hair whispered something to her friend, who smothered a laugh behind her hand. Professor Winters' eyebrow lifted slightly. "Interesting," he said in a tone that suggested the opposite. "It's quite a jump from retail to engineering. This course moves quickly. I hope you've kept your math skills sharp." Heat rose to Lucia's cheeks. "I handle all the ordering and inventory calculations at work," she offered, immediately wishing she hadn't. Managing stock levels at a small-town supermarket hardly seemed impressive in a college classroom. "Well, we'll see how that translates to calculus, won't we?" Professor Winters smiled thinly before moving on to the next student. Lucia sank lower in her seat. The message was clear. People like her didn't belong in engineering. She'd heard versions of this her whole life. When she'd won the middle school math competition, Mr. Grayson had called it unexpected. When she'd fixed the ancient cash register that even the repairman couldn't figure out, her manager had called it beginner's luck. The introductions continued around her, but Lucia barely heard them. She was too busy fighting the voice in her head telling her to grab her backpack and walk out. What was she thinking anyway? She was a 34-year-old grocery worker with a GED trying to become an engineer. It was like deciding to climb Mount Everest after walking up a small hill. Now that we've all met, Professor Winters said, pulling Lucia back to the present, let's discuss expectations. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, revealing a dense schedule of topics, assignments, and tests. This course moves quickly. We have 16 weeks to cover material that builds the foundation for all your future mathematics courses. If you fall behind, you will struggle to catch up. His gaze seemed to linger on Lucia as he added, some of you may find this material particularly challenging. I recommend forming study groups early. My office hours are listed on the syllabus, though they tend to fill up before exams. As Professor Winters launched into an overview of the course, Lucia opened her brand new notebook, dark blue, with reinforced pages that wouldn't tear easily. She'd spent 20 minutes in the store aisle choosing it, wanting everything to be perfect for her first day. Now it seemed silly, like a child dressing up in adult clothes. For our first topic, we'll review foundational concepts, Professor Winters continued. Consider this a diagnostic to see where you stand. He wrote a series of equations on the board, and Lucia felt a small surge of relief. These looked familiar. Algebra she'd taught herself from used textbooks over the years. Maybe this wouldn't be so bad after all. Take 10 minutes to solve these, he instructed. Work independently. This isn't graded, but it will give us both an idea of any areas you need to focus on. Lucia bent over her paper, pencil moving steadily. The classroom fell quiet except for the scratch of pencils and occasional sighs. She finished the first 5 problems quickly, then slowed down on the 6th, double-checking her work. Math had always been like a puzzle to her. Not easy exactly, but satisfying. Each step led logically to the next, unlike the messy uncertainties of real life. After 8 minutes, she'd finished all 10 problems. She reviewed her work while waiting for time to be called, noticing the furrowed brows around her. The dark-haired girl who had whispered earlier was chewing her pencil eraser, having apparently only completed the first few problems. Time, Professor Winters announced. Exchange papers with the person next to you. We'll go through the answers together. Lucia turned to the person on her right, a young man with glasses and a serious expression who'd introduced himself as Raj, a transfer student. Here, she said, handing over her paper. He gave her his in return, and she saw immediately that he'd only attempted 7 problems, with several crossed-out false starts. Professor Winters worked through each problem on the board, explaining the steps. Lucia had gotten all 10 correct. Raj had managed 5. When they exchanged papers back, he looked at hers with surprise. You got them all right, he said quietly. Just lucky, I guess, Lucia replied automatically, the practiced response of someone used to downplaying her abilities. That's not luck, Raj said, shaking his head. That's knowing what you're doing. Before Lucia could respond, Professor Winters's voice cut through the classroom chatter. It seems we have quite a range of preparedness, he said, scanning the room. Some of you may need to consider whether this course is the right fit. Remember, Mathematics 101 is still open for enrollment this week. Again, his gaze seemed to find Lucia, despite her perfect score. The message was clear. Her kind didn't belong, regardless of ability. As the class ended and students gathered their things, Lucia remained seated, watching Professor Winters erase the board with precise, methodical strokes. Part of her wanted to approach him, to ask directly why he seemed so certain she would fail. Another part knew exactly what he would say. Something polite but dismissive about the rigors of academic mathematics versus practical arithmetic. Instead, she carefully placed her notebook in her backpack and stood up. 1 class down, hundreds to go. If she was going to prove anything, it wouldn't be through words, but through work. She'd been underestimated her whole life, by teachers, bosses, even family members who thought she was wasting her potential at the grocery store. One more doubter hardly mattered. As she walked out into the bright September sunshine, Lucia felt something she hadn't expected after such a discouraging first class. Determination. Professor Winters might think she didn't belong, but she'd been fighting that battle her whole life. And she was still standing. 1 day at a time, she told herself, adjusting her backpack strap. 1 problem at a time. She headed toward the campus coffee shop to review the syllabus before her next class. She had a lot of catching up to do, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be, even if others disagreed. 3 weeks into the semester, Lucia had settled into a routine. Wake up at 5 a.m., study for 2 hours before her morning classes, attend lectures until 2 p.m., work the closing shift at Pine Creek Market, then study again until midnight, sleep, repeat. Her tiny apartment had transformed into a shrine to mathematics, notebooks stacked on the kitchen table, sticky notes with formulas on the bathroom mirror, practice problems taped beside her bed for those moments when sleep wouldn't come. So far, she'd managed to keep up, even excel. Each assignment returned with a neat A or A in Professor Winter's precise red handwriting. Yet his attitude toward her hadn't warmed. If anything, her success seemed to irritate him, as if she were somehow cheating at a game whose rules only he understood. Today, she arrived early to class as usual, sliding into her seat and arranging her materials with practiced precision. Calculator on the right, notebook open to a fresh page, 2 sharpened pencils, 1 blue pen for important notes. Around her, the classroom filled with the usual chatter and morning complaints. "Did you hear about the special problem?" A voice from behind caught her attention. It was Tyler, the computer science student, talking to his study group. "Yeah, my roommate had Winters last semester. Said it was impossible, no one got it right," replied another student. Lucia pretended to review her notes while listening. Special problem? She'd read the entire syllabus, and there was no mention of any special assessment beyond the regular homework and exams. Professor Winters entered precisely at 9 a.m., briefcase in hand. Unlike his usual routine of immediately diving into the lecture, today he seemed almost excited, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Good morning," he began, setting his materials down. "We've been making excellent progress through the standard curriculum. Today, however, I thought we might try something different." He turned to the whiteboard and uncapped a marker. "Every semester I like to challenge my students with a special problem, one that requires not just procedural knowledge, but true mathematical insight." The room grew quiet, tension building as Professor Winters wrote across the board. The equation sprawled from one end to the other. A complex calculus problem involving multiple derivatives and what looked like an optimization scenario. "This," he announced, capping the marker with a satisfying click, "is what separates the mathematical thinkers from those who merely follow steps. My advanced students typically need about 30 minutes to solve this. Some never reach the correct answer." His gaze swept the classroom, lingering briefly on Lucia. "You have the entire class period. Begin." Students hurriedly pulled out calculators and scratch paper. Some formed impromptu groups, whispering strategies to each other. Others stared at the board in obvious panic. Lucia remained still, studying the problem. There was something familiar about it. Not the formal mathematics, that was beyond what she'd learned so far, but the underlying pattern. It reminded her of something practical, something she'd encountered in her everyday life. "Bet the grocery lady won't even know where to start," came a whisper from behind, followed by muffled laughter. The dark-haired girl Zoe and her friends. Lucia's cheeks burned, but she kept her eyes on the board. The equation described a scenario involving rates of change and optimal allocation, different variables affecting each other over time, with constraints. As she stared, the academic symbols began to transform in her mind, reshaping themselves into something concrete: inventory management. It was like the system she'd developed at the store for seasonal produce ordering. How many strawberries to stock in summer when demand was high but spoilage quick. How to balance oranges in winter against limited shelf space needed for holiday items. The variables were different, but the relationship between them followed the same pattern. Lucia didn't reach for her calculator. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the problem as stacks of fruit, delivery trucks, customer patterns. She'd spent years developing an intuition for these relationships, creating mental shortcuts that bypassed formal calculations. 17 seconds after she began this mental process, the solution crystallized. She opened her eyes and began writing. Not the formal mathematical proof that Professor Winters probably expected, but her own approach, a practical method based on real-world experience. She raised her hand. Professor Winters, who had been pacing the room watching students struggle, looked annoyed at the interruption. He checked his watch. Barely 3 minutes had passed. "Yes, Ms. Reyes." His tone suggested he expected a question, not an answer. "I think I have the solution," Lucia said quietly. A few students looked up from their work, expressions ranging from disbelief to amusement. Professor Winters' mouth tightened. "You've barely started," he pointed out. I know, but Lucia hesitated, suddenly uncertain. What if she was completely wrong? What if her practical approach had nothing to do with the formal mathematics? She'd be confirming every doubt the professor had about her. But something made her continue. I approached it differently. I'd like to try my answer. Professor Winters sighed. Very well. Come to the board. The walk to the front of the classroom felt endless. 20 pairs of eyes followed her movement, most expecting, perhaps hoping to witness her failure. She picked up a blue marker, different from the black one Professor Winters had used, and began writing to the side of the original problem. This isn't the standard approach, she explained, her voice gaining confidence as she worked. But if we think about what the equation is actually describing, it's a resource allocation problem with changing variables and fixed constraints. She continued writing, explaining as she went. In practical terms, it's like managing inventory with seasonal demand fluctuations against fixed shelf space and varying spoilage rates. When I worked with problems like this at the store, I found shortcuts. The class watched in silence as her marker moved across the board. Professor Winters' expression shifted from dismissive to puzzled to intensely focused. When she finished writing the final value, the optimal solution, she capped the marker and turned to face him. Is this right? She asked. Professor Winters stared at her work, then at the original problem, then back at her solution. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, presumably the answer key, and checked it against her work. That's, he began, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. That's correct. A murmur ran through the classroom. But your method, he continued, studying her work. It's unorthodox. You didn't use Lagrangian multipliers or set the derivatives equal to 0. He looked genuinely perplexed. How did you see this approach? Lucia shrugged slightly. When you've spent years figuring out how many peaches to order in August with limited refrigerator space, and 3 days until they spoil, you develop shortcuts. For the first time, Professor Winters looked at her, really looked at her, not as an inconvenience or an oddity, but as someone worth understanding. Explain it again, he said. Not a command this time, but a request. Lucia turned back to the board and walked through her thinking step by step. She explained how she'd visualized the constraints as physical limitations, how she'd recognized patterns in the changing variables that allowed her to bypass several formal steps. As she spoke, she grew more animated, using her hands to illustrate concepts, drawing additional diagrams to clarify her points. The class, initially skeptical, began to engage. Raj asked how she'd recognized the pattern so quickly. Tyler wondered if her approach could be generalized to other types of problems. Even Zoe, who had mocked her earlier, was taking notes. Professor Winters remained silent until she finished. Then he cleared his throat. Ms. Reyes, he said slowly, what you've demonstrated here is remarkable. You've developed an intuitive understanding of optimization that many of my graduate students still struggle with. He adjusted his glasses, as if seeing her for the first time. And you did this through your work at the grocery store? Yes, Lucia replied. When resources are limited and demands keep changing, you either find better ways to calculate or you fail. We couldn't afford to fail. The classroom was completely silent now. No whispers, no shuffling papers. In 30 years of teaching, Professor Winters said, addressing the entire class, I've never seen anyone solve this problem this way. He turned back to Lucia. You've reminded me of something important today, Ms. Reyes. Mathematics isn't just an academic exercise. It's a practical tool that exists in the real world, often in places we don't think to look. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. As students gathered their things, several approached Lucia with questions and comments. Raj asked if she would join their study group. Tyler wanted to know if she could help him with his programming assignment that used optimization algorithms. Even Zoe lingered, eventually approaching to apologize for her earlier comments. I was being a jerk, she admitted. I've just always been told I was good at math, and seeing you solve that so easily, it made me feel stupid. Math isn't about being smart or stupid, Lucia replied. It's about finding patterns and solving problems. Sometimes life experience helps you see patterns that textbooks don't teach. As the classroom emptied, Professor Winters called Lucia to his desk. Ms. Reyes, he began, seeming uncharacteristically hesitant. I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your abilities based on your background. That was unprofessional and, frankly, short-sighted of me. Lucia nodded, accepting his words without comment. Your approach to today's problem has significant implications, he continued. Would you be willing to discuss it further during my office hours? I think there might be applications beyond what you've considered. I'd like that, Lucia said, gathering her notebooks. As she turned to leave, Professor Winters spoke again. Ms. Reyes, thank you for the reminder that wisdom comes in many forms. It's a lesson I should have learned long ago. Walking out into the bright autumn sunshine, Lucia felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since starting college, she didn't feel like an imposter. She belonged here not despite her background, but because of it. Her years at the grocery store weren't a detour from education. They were an education of their own kind, teaching her to see patterns where others saw only numbers. She pulled out her phone to call her Uncle Pete. He'd always believed in her problem-solving mind, even when she doubted herself. Today, finally, she was beginning to believe it too. News of Lucia's unconventional solution spread through the mathematics department like wildfire. By the next morning, students she'd never met nodded to her in the hallways. A teaching assistant from advanced calculus stopped her in the cafeteria to ask about her method. Even the dean of the science department, Dr. Chen, sent her an email requesting a meeting. I don't understand what the big deal is, Lucia told Raj as they walked across campus after class. They'd formed a study group with Tyler and 2 other students, meeting 3 times a week in the library. I just solved a problem. People solve problems every day. Not that problem, Raj said, shaking his head, and definitely not in 17 seconds. He adjusted his glasses, a habit when he was about to explain something. That equation is famous in our department. Professor Winters has been using it for years to humble students. The fastest anyone's ever solved it was 12 minutes, and that was a math prodigy who's now working at NASA. Lucia frowned. But it wasn't that complicated once you saw the pattern. That's exactly the point, Raj insisted. No one else saw that pattern. You found a connection between practical experience and theoretical mathematics that no one had documented before. They reached the mathematics building, where Lucia was scheduled to meet with Professor Winters during his office hours. Raj gave her an encouraging smile before heading to his next class. Let me know how it goes, he called over his shoulder. The group wants to hear everything. Lucia climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, where the faculty offices lined a long hallway. Names and titles on wooden plaques adorned each door. She found Professor Winters' office at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar. She knocked gently. Come in, called the familiar voice. Professor Winters' office was exactly what Lucia had expected: meticulously organized bookshelves, a desk clear of clutter, mathematical models displayed on a side table. What she hadn't expected was the presence of another person, Dr. Chen, the dean she'd only seen from a distance at orientation. Ms. Reyes, Professor Winters greeted her, rising from his chair. Thank you for coming. I believe you received an email from Dean Chen? Yes, Lucia nodded, suddenly nervous. Had she done something wrong? Was solving the problem some kind of violation of class rules? Please sit down, Dr. Chen said, gesturing to an empty chair. She was a small woman with short gray hair and bright, intelligent eyes behind red-framed glasses. Professor Winters has been telling me about your remarkable solution to his optimization problem. Lucia sat, placing her backpack carefully on the floor beside her. I just approached it differently, she said, downplaying her achievement as she'd been conditioned to do her entire life. That's precisely why we wanted to speak with you, Professor Winters said, his usual brisk tone softened with something that might have been respect. Your different approach has significant implications. Dr. Chen nodded enthusiastically. The method you developed intuitively through your work experience represents a practical application of optimization theory that could simplify complex calculations. In various fields, Lucia looked between them, confused. But I didn't develop a method. I just figured out a way to order strawberries without losing money. Professor Winters pulled a notepad toward him. Walk us through your thinking again, if you would. Start with the strawberries. For the next hour, Lucia explained how she'd developed her inventory management system at Pine Creek Market, how she'd noticed patterns in customer behavior, weather effects on produce sales, and the relationship between pricing and turnover. She described creating mental shortcuts to calculate optimal order quantities without using formal equations. As she spoke, Professor Winters filled pages with notes and diagrams. Dr. Chen occasionally asked clarifying questions, her expression growing increasingly animated. "Fascinating," the dean said when Lucia finished. "You've essentially developed a heuristic approach to stochastic optimization problems without any formal training in the field." "I don't know what those words mean," Lucia admitted. Dr. Chen smiled. "You don't need to. That's what makes this so remarkable. You've arrived at advanced mathematical concepts through practical problem solving. Your intuitive method bypasses several computational steps that make these problems so difficult to solve quickly." Professor Winters turned his notepad around, showing Lucia the equations he'd written based on her explanation. "What you've described can be formalized mathematically like this," he said, pointing to a series of expressions. "But your mental process skips directly from here." He indicated one part of the equation. To here, his finger moved to the final result. "The implications for teaching applied mathematics are significant," Dr. Chen added. "Your approach could help students understand these concepts more intuitively before diving into the formal mathematics." Lucia stared at the equations, seeing her everyday thinking translated into academic language. It was strange, like hearing someone describe in technical terms how you tie your shoes or ride a bike. Actions you perform without conscious thought. "So, what happens now?" she asked, feeling slightly overwhelmed. Dr. Chen and Professor Winters exchanged glances. "We'd like to offer you a position," the dean said, "a research assistantship in our applied mathematics department, working with Professor Winters and Dr. Lopez, our optimization specialist." "But I'm just a first-year student," Lucia protested. "I haven't even taken formal calculus yet." "Which makes your insights even more valuable," Professor Winters said. "You're approaching these problems without the constraints of traditional mathematical training. Sometimes that fresh perspective is exactly what established fields need." "The position comes with a stipend," Dr. Chen added, correctly guessing that practical concerns would matter to Lucia. "Not a fortune, but enough that you could reduce your hours at the market and focus more on your studies and research." Lucia's mind raced. A research position? In the mathematics department? Just weeks ago, she'd been questioning whether she even belonged in college, and now the dean was offering her a job. "I'd need to keep some hours at the store," she said finally. "They've been good to me, and I can't just leave them short-handed." "Of course," Dr. Chen nodded. "We can work around your schedule. The important thing is documenting and formalizing your approach. Professor Winters believes there's potential for a publication." "A publication?" Lucia repeated, the word feeling foreign in her mouth. "You mean like in a scientific journal?" "Exactly," Professor Winters confirmed. "Your method represents a novel approach to a class of problems that has significant real-world applications. That's precisely what journals in applied mathematics look for." The meeting concluded with practical details. Paperwork to complete, schedules to arrange, introductions to be made to other faculty members. As Lucia left the office, her head spinning with possibilities she'd never imagined, Professor Winters called after her. "Ms. Reyes, Lucia," he said, using her first name for the first time. "I want to apologize again for my initial skepticism about your abilities." Lucia turned back, meeting his gaze directly. "You know, Professor, people have been underestimating me my whole life. I'm used to it." "That doesn't make it right," he replied, "especially from someone whose job is to recognize and nurture potential. I failed in that responsibility, and I'm sorry." She nodded, accepting his apology without bitterness. "Maybe this can be a learning experience for both of us." "Indeed," he said with a small smile, "though I believe you're already far ahead in that department." The next few weeks passed in a blur of new experiences. Lucia began working with Professor Winters and Dr. Lopez, translating her intuitive methods into formal mathematical language. She reduced her hours at Pine Creek Market to weekends only, using the research stipend to cover her basic expenses. The store manager, Mr. Guzman, surprised her with his enthusiastic support. "Always knew you were meant for bigger things," he said when she explained the situation. "Just didn't expect it would involve math." Her study group expanded as word spread about the grocery store mathematician, as some students had begun calling her. What had started as 5 people meeting in the library grew to 15, then 20. Students from various majors seeking Lucia's help in applying mathematical concepts to practical problems. You explain things differently, Tyler told her after she'd helped him understand a particularly difficult programming algorithm. The textbook gives steps, but you show why the steps make sense in the real world. Even Zoe, who had once mocked her, became a regular at the study sessions. I've spent years memorizing formulas without understanding what they're actually for, she admitted one evening. You make the numbers mean something. Dr. Lopez, a veteran professor with 30 years of research experience, became Lucia's biggest advocate in the department. She has mathematical intuition that can't be taught, he told his colleagues. We can fill in the formal gaps in her education, but her natural insight into patterns and relationships, that's a rare gift. 6 weeks after solving the impossible problem, Lucia found herself in a conference room presenting her method to the entire mathematics faculty. Her hands trembled slightly as she uncapped a marker and began writing on the whiteboard, but her voice remained steady. The traditional approach to these optimization problems follows these steps, she began, writing out the standard method. But in practical applications, we can recognize certain patterns that allow us to bypass several computational steps. As she explained her approach, translating her grocery store experience into academic language she'd learned over the past weeks, she noticed the expressions of the professors changing, from polite interest to genuine engagement, from skepticism to understanding. When she finished, the questions came rapidly. Not dismissive challenges, but genuine curiosity about applications, limitations, extensions of her method. She answered as best she could, deferring to Professor Winters or Dr. Lopez when the questions ventured into territory she hadn't yet explored. We believe this approach has significant potential for publication, Dr. Lopez concluded, addressing his colleagues. We're aiming for the Journal of Applied Mathematics and Optimization for our first paper. As the meeting broke up, faculty members approached Lucia individually, introducing themselves, offering congratulations or asking follow-up questions. Dr. Chen stood back, watching with evident satisfaction before approaching Lucia. How does it feel? The dean asked quietly. Lucia thought for a moment. Surreal, she finally answered. 6 weeks ago, I was just trying not to fail my classes. Now I'm discussing publication with math professors. Dr. Chen smiled. The path to discovery is rarely straight, Ms. Reyes. Sometimes the most valuable insights come from unexpected places, like a small-town supermarket. She patted Lucia's arm. Remember that when you're teaching your own students someday? Teaching? Lucia shook her head. I'm just trying to get through this semester. Perhaps, the dean replied with a knowing look. But I suspect this is just the beginning of your journey. Walking back across campus in the golden afternoon light, Lucia allowed herself to imagine possibilities that had never before seemed within reach. Not just completing her degree, but perhaps graduate school, research, even teaching. Paths that had seemed closed to a small-town grocery worker were suddenly opening before her. Her phone buzzed with a text from her Uncle Pete. How's college treating my favorite problem solver? She smiled and typed back, better than I ever imagined. Turns out those years of figuring out how many strawberries to order might actually change the way people think about math. Always knew you were special, came his reply. The world's just finally catching up. 3 months after solving Professor Winters' impossible problem, Lucia sat at her kitchen table surrounded by stacks of research papers. Coffee cups formed a small city across the surface, each one marking hours of work. Outside, winter had settled over the campus, turning the world quiet and white. I can't believe we're actually doing this, she murmured, running her finger down a page filled with equations. Equations that described her own thinking, her own method, now formalized into academic language. The paper she was working on with Professor Winters and Dr. Lopez had evolved from a simple case study into something more substantial. What began as documenting her approach to inventory optimization had expanded as they discovered applications in fields ranging from traffic flow management to hospital resource allocation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Raj. Ready for tomorrow? Tomorrow. The word sent butterflies through her stomach. Tomorrow she would present their research at the Regional Mathematics Conference, her first academic presentation. Students rarely got such opportunities, but Dr. Chen had insisted. Your perspective is what makes this work unique, the dean had told her. The academic community needs to hear it directly from you. Lucia texted back. Nervous. Still practicing my slides. 3 dots appeared immediately, then Raj's reply. You'll be amazing. The whole study group is coming to cheer you on. The study group had become her anchor through this whirlwind semester. What started as casual meetings in the library had evolved into a tight-knit community of 20-plus students from various majors. They called themselves the Pattern Seekers, focusing on finding real-world applications for theoretical concepts. Lucia's phone rang. Professor Winters, probably with last-minute changes to their presentation. Hello? She answered, already reaching for a pen. Lucia. His voice sounded different than usual, tense, excited. I just got off the phone with Dr. Patel from Berkeley, the optimization specialist. Lucia had read several of Dr. Patel's papers while working on their research. Yes, she read our pre-print paper, the one we submitted to the journal last month. Lucia held her breath. Their paper had been submitted to the Journal of Applied Mathematics and Optimization, but they weren't expecting feedback for at least 3 more months. And, she prompted when Professor Winters didn't continue immediately, she wants to meet you. She's flying in for the conference specifically to see your presentation. The pen slipped from Lucia's fingers. Dr. Patel is coming to hear me? But I'm just a first-year student. A first-year student who's co-authored a paper that, according to Dr. Patel, presents a paradigm shift in practical applications of optimization theory. For once, Professor Winters sounded almost giddy. Those were her exact words. After they hung up, Lucia sat motionless at her table, staring at the piles of research without seeing them. Just 9 months ago, she'd been arranging produce displays and calculating inventory orders. Now a renowned mathematician was flying across the country to hear her speak. Her phone buzzed again. This time her Uncle Pete. How's my favorite math genius? His text read. Lucia smiled. Uncle Pete had been her champion since she was a child. The one who bought her puzzle books and encouraged her problem-solving skills when everyone else saw only a quiet girl who was good with numbers. Terrified, she replied honestly. Presenting research tomorrow. Important people coming. His response came quickly. Remember what I always told you about puzzles? She did remember. Whenever she got stuck on a difficult puzzle as a kid, frustrated to the point of giving up, he would tap her forehead gently and say, the solution is already in there. You just have to trust yourself to find it. Trust myself, she texted back. Exactly. You've got this, kid. That night, Lucia barely slept. She practiced her presentation in front of her bathroom mirror, rehearsed answers to potential questions, revised slides until the words blurred before her eyes. When her alarm finally sounded at 6 a.m., she had been awake for hours. The conference was being held at Westlake's main auditorium, a grand building at the center of campus. When Lucia arrived, the place was already buzzing with mathematicians, professors, and students from universities across the region. Name tags, coffee cups, animated discussions about theorems and applications. It was a world she was still getting used to. Lucia. Professor Winters waved from across the lobby. Beside him stood Dr. Lopez and a woman Lucia recognized from academic journals, Dr. Patel herself, one of the leading minds in optimization theory. As Lucia approached, her hands clutching her presentation notes, Dr. Patel stepped forward with a warm smile. Ms. Reyes, she said, extending her hand. I'm Anjali Patel. Your paper has caused quite a stir in our department at Berkeley. Thank you for coming, Lucia managed, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm honored you found our work interesting. Interesting? Dr. Patel laughed. It's revolutionary. The beauty of your approach is its accessibility. You've found a way to make complex optimization intuitive, something I've been trying to teach my graduate students for years. Before Lucia could respond, more people approached, professors from other universities who had read the preprint, students curious about the grocery store mathematician they'd heard about. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and brief discussions. Finally, it was time. Lucia followed Professor Winters into the presentation hall, a room with tiered seating that could hold 300 people. She had expected perhaps 50 attendees for their session, mostly local faculty and students. The room was packed. Standing room only. Word got around, Professor Winters murmured, looking pleased. Lucia spotted her study group in the 3rd row, Raj giving her a thumbs up. Zoe beside him nodding encouragingly. Even Mr. Guzman from the grocery store had come, sitting awkwardly in a suit that looked rarely worn. As Professor Winters introduced their research, Lucia took deep breaths, calming herself. When he called her name, she walked to the podium, placed her notes carefully on the surface, and looked out at the sea of faces. My journey to this research began in an unlikely place. She started, her voice quiet but clear, not in a mathematics classroom or a research lab, but in the produce section of Pine Creek Market. A soft chuckle rippled through the audience, easing her nerves slightly. For 16 years, I managed inventory at a small grocery store. Each day presented the same fundamental problem: how to order the right amount of perishable goods to maximize profit while minimizing waste, with constantly changing variables like weather, seasonal demand, and limited storage space. As she continued, explaining how her practical experience had led to the insights formalized in their paper, Lucia felt something shift inside her. The nervousness didn't disappear, but it transformed into a different kind of energy, a confidence in the value of her unique perspective. She moved through her slides, explaining complex concepts in simple, accessible terms, drawing parallels between theoretical optimization and everyday problems. The audience leaned forward in their seats, professors nodding as connections became clear, students scribbling notes frantically. When she finished the prepared presentation, the questions began. Hands shot up across the room, not just from professors, but from students, industry professionals, applied mathematicians. Have you explored applications in supply chain management? Could your method be adapted for emergency response resource allocation? How does your approach handle stochastic variables like weather patterns? Lucia answered each question thoughtfully, sometimes deferring to Professor Winters or Dr. Lopez for the more technical aspects, but always bringing the discussion back to practical, intuitive understanding. Dr. Patel raised her hand last. Ms. Reyes, have you considered how your method might be taught to students who, like yourself, come from non-traditional backgrounds? Those who might have practical experience but lack formal mathematical training? The question hung in the air, opening a possibility Lucia hadn't considered. I haven't, she admitted, but I think there's tremendous value in bridging that gap, helping people see the mathematics in their everyday problem solving, and helping mathematicians understand the practical wisdom that exists outside academia. Dr. Patel nodded, satisfied. I would be very interested in collaborating on such a pedagogical approach. As the session ended, people crowded around Lucia, asking for her contact information, suggesting collaborations, offering congratulations. Professor Winters stood back, watching with undisguised pride. When the crowd finally thinned, Mr. Guzman approached, straightening his tie nervously. Didn't understand half of what you said up there, he admitted with a grin, but I understood enough to know it was special. Thank you for coming, Lucia said, genuinely touched. None of this would have happened if you hadn't been flexible with my work schedule all these years. Are you kidding? I'm telling everyone my produce manager is a mathematical genius. Best advertising the store ever had. His expression grew serious. Your parents would have been so proud, Lucia. They always knew you were meant for big things. The mention of her parents, her mother who had died when Lucia was in high school, her father who had passed away just 2 years ago, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. I wish they could have seen this, she said quietly. They're seeing it, Mr. Guzman assured her, patting her shoulder awkwardly before moving away to give others a chance to speak with her. Dr. Patel approached next, along with Dr. Chen. Ms. Reyes, we have a proposal for you, Dr. Patel began. Berkeley is hosting a summer institute on applied mathematics for non-traditional students. After seeing your presentation today, we would like you to consider teaching a module on intuitive approaches to optimization. Teaching? Lucia echoed, surprised. But I'm still a student myself. Sometimes the best teachers are those who remember what it's like to learn, Dr. Chen said. Your ability to translate between practical experience and formal mathematics is exactly what this program needs. As the conference continued around them, Lucia found a quiet corner to absorb everything that had happened. Her phone buzzed with congratulatory texts from the study group members, from Uncle Pete, even from former co-workers at the grocery store who had watched a live stream of her presentation. Professor Winters found her there, 2 coffee cups in hand. He offered one to her silently. "Thank you," she said, accepting both the coffee and the moment of quiet. "No," he replied after a pause. "Thank you, Lucia, for reminding an old mathematician that there are many paths to understanding, and that wisdom doesn't always come with degrees and titles." She smiled, sipping the coffee. "We all have our blind spots, Professor." "Indeed. And the best way to overcome them is to listen to voices we might otherwise overlook." He gestured to the conference around them. "Your voice is being heard now. Make sure you use it well." As evening approached, Lucia joined her study group for a celebratory dinner. Surrounded by these friends who had supported her journey, she finally allowed herself to fully appreciate how far she had come. "To the woman who solved the impossible problem," Raj toasted, raising his glass, and showed us all that mathematics isn't just about formulas, it's about seeing patterns in the world around us. "And to the pattern seekers," Lucia added, raising her own glass, "for teaching me that I don't have to solve every problem alone." Outside the restaurant window, snow began to fall again, adding another layer of white to the winter landscape. Like that snow, Lucia thought. Knowledge accumulated layer by layer, sometimes from textbooks and lectures, sometimes from 16 years of ordering strawberries and counting inventory. Each experience adding to the pattern, creating something beautiful and complex from countless simple elements. And in that moment, she knew with certainty that she had finally found her place in the world. 3 years later, Lucia stood at the front of a packed classroom, watching as her students wrestled with the problem she'd written on the board. It wasn't the impossible problem from Professor Winter's class. That one was saved for a special day each semester. Today's challenge was designed to help her students see the connection between abstract mathematics and the world around them. 5 more minutes, she announced, smiling as she noticed the familiar expressions of concentration, frustration, and occasional breakthrough. The classroom looked nothing like traditional math spaces. Instead of neat rows facing forward, tables were arranged in small groups. The walls were covered not just with formulas, but with photographs connecting mathematical concepts to real-world applications. A farmer's market display illustrating distribution problems, traffic patterns demonstrating flow optimization, even a bakery kitchen showing proportional reasoning. This was applied mathematics for real-world problem solvers, the course Lucia had developed after completing her accelerated bachelor's degree in mathematics. Now in its 2nd year, the class had become one of the most popular electives at Westlake, drawing students from business, engineering, agriculture, healthcare, and many other fields. As the timer on Lucia's desk chimed softly, she called the class to attention. "All right, let's see what you've come up with. Remember, there's no single right approach here. I'm interested in your thinking process." Hands went up across the room. Lucia called on a woman in her 50s, one of several non-traditional students in the class. "I've been a nurse for 30 years, the woman began, so I recognize this as a resource allocation problem, similar to what we face during shift changes. I approached it by prioritizing the most critical needs first, then optimizing the remaining resources." Lucia nodded encouragingly. "Excellent connection to your professional experience. Healthcare settings provide perfect examples of these constraints." Next, a young man who worked part-time at his family's restaurant shared his approach, followed by a retired military officer who saw the problem through the lens of logistics planning. This was exactly what Lucia had hoped for when she designed the course, creating space for people to recognize the mathematics they were already using in their daily lives and work, then helping them formalize and expand that intuitive knowledge. After class, Lucia gathered her materials and headed across campus for her weekly meeting with Professor Winters. In the 3 years since she'd solved his impossible problem, their relationship had evolved from skeptical teacher and unlikely student to respected colleagues. He had become her mentor, thesis advisor, and eventually, her friend. Now they co-directed the Center for Practical Applications of Mathematical Theory, a new initiative funded partly by a grant from the National Science Foundation and partly by industry partners interested in bridging theoretical research and practical problem solving. She found him in their shared office space, surrounded by the organized chaos of ongoing projects. "How was class?" he asked, looking up from his computer. "Fantastic," Lucia replied, dropping into the chair across from him. The healthcare workers always have the most interesting approaches to allocation problems. Not surprising. They're making life or death decisions with limited resources every day. He pushed a folder across the desk. The final numbers came in from the Summer Institute. Thought you'd want to see them. Lucia opened the folder, scanning the evaluation data from the 6-week summer program they'd just completed. The Institute had brought together 50 participants: factory workers, farmers, retail managers, healthcare providers, and others with minimal formal education, but extensive practical experience solving complex problems in their fields. The results were even better than they'd hoped. Participants had shown remarkable progress in translating their intuitive methods into formal mathematical language, while also developing new approaches to long-standing challenges in their industries. 92% said they've already implemented changes in their workplaces, Lucia noted, reading through the comments. And look at this. 4 of them have applied to degree programs. Professor Winters smiled, the expression softening his usually serious face. The dean is thrilled. The board of trustees even more so. They're talking about expanding the program next year, possibly offering it in multiple locations. We'll need more instructors, Lucia mused, already making mental notes, and we should follow up with this year's participants. Document how they're applying what they learned. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the open door. Dr. Chen stood there, looking as put together as always despite the summer heat. Sorry to interrupt, the dean said, but I wanted to deliver this in person. She handed Lucia a large envelope bearing the logo of the Journal of Applied Mathematics and Optimization. Lucia's fingers trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside was the final published version of her latest paper, Intuitive Approaches to Complex Optimization, a framework for translating practical experience into formal mathematics. It's officially out today, Dr. Chen said, unable to hide her pride. Your 3rd published paper and the first where you're the lead author. Lucia ran her hand over the glossy cover of the journal. 3 years ago, she couldn't have imagined seeing her name in print, her ideas being discussed in universities around the world. There's something else, Dr. Chen continued. The National Conference on Mathematics Education has invited you to give the keynote address at their annual meeting in November. They're particularly interested in your work on making advanced mathematics accessible to non-traditional learners. After the dean left, Professor Winters leaned back in his chair, regarding Lucia thoughtfully. Remember your first day in my class, he asked, when I suggested you might want to consider a less challenging course? Lucia laughed. How could I forget? I nearly took your advice. I've been teaching for over 30 years, he said, his voice growing serious. In all that time, my greatest failure as an educator was almost turning away one of the most gifted mathematical minds I've ever encountered, simply because that mind didn't fit my narrow definition of what a mathematician should look like or where they should come from. We all have our blind spots, Lucia replied, echoing the words she'd said to him years ago after her conference presentation. Indeed, and thanks to you, many more students will have the opportunity to be seen for their potential, not just their background. He glanced at his watch. Speaking of which, aren't you meeting your study group soon? The Pattern Seekers had continued long after its founding members had graduated. Now Lucia served as faculty advisor to the group, which had grown to include over 50 regular members from all disciplines. They met weekly in the library, the same space where Lucia had once nervously joined her first study session. As she walked across the sunlit campus, Lucia's phone buzzed with a text from Uncle Pete, who never missed a chance to check in on his niece's accomplishments. Heard about the journal article from Mr. Guzman. Front page news at Pine Creek Market. Lucia smiled, typing back, Tell him I'm still using his strawberry inventory problem as an example in my classes. She passed the mathematics building where it had all started, where a quiet, self-doubting grocery worker had walked into a classroom feeling like an imposter. Now students nodded to her as she passed, some stopping to ask questions about assignments or upcoming projects. The library was bustling with summer session activity. Lucia found her way to the large study room where the Pattern Seekers met. Through the glass walls, she could see that many had already arrived, a mix of traditional students straight from high school and older learners returning to education after years in the workforce. Raj was there, now in his final year of a PhD program, still wearing his signature glasses. Zoe had graduated and gone on to medical school, but returned occasionally when she was in town. New faces had joined, each bringing their own perspective and experience to the group. As Lucia entered, the conversations paused briefly as the group acknowledged her arrival, then continued with renewed energy. She didn't lead these sessions, that wasn't the point. Instead, she joined a table where a heated but friendly debate was underway about the best approach to a scheduling problem. Dr. Reyes, one of the newer members, asked, still uncomfortable using her first name despite her insistence, "Could you look at my approach? I'm trying to apply your framework to restaurant staffing optimization." "Of course," Lucia replied, sliding into an empty chair. "And please, it's just Lucia." As she reviewed the students' work, offering suggestions and asking questions to guide rather than direct, Lucia reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From being ridiculed in a mathematics class to becoming Dr. Lucia Reyes, assistant professor and published researcher, it was a path she could never have predicted. Later that evening, after the study session ended, Lucia stopped by her office to pick up materials for tomorrow's class. The campus was quiet, most students and faculty having left for the day. As she gathered her things, she noticed a small package on her desk that hadn't been there earlier. Inside was a framed photograph of Pine Creek Market's produce section, with a note from Mr. Guzman, where it all began. "Never forget that real-world problems need real-world problem solvers." Lucia placed the frame on her desk, next to her academic awards and published papers. The juxtaposition felt right, a reminder that valuable knowledge comes from many sources, and that sometimes the most profound insights emerge from the most ordinary places. The next morning, Lucia arrived early to prepare for her first class. As students began filing in, she wrote a question on the board. "Where have you encountered mathematics in your everyday life this week?" It was the same question she asked at the beginning of every course, the question that had transformed her own understanding of what mathematics could be and who could contribute to it. As the classroom filled with people from all backgrounds, traditional students, working professionals, retirees starting new chapters, Lucia felt a profound sense of purpose. Each person brought unique experiences and perspectives that could reshape how problems were understood and solved. "Good morning," she began when everyone was seated. "My name is Dr. Lucia Reyes, and this is Applied Mathematics for Real-World Problem Solvers." She gestured to the question on the board. "Before we dive into formulas and theories, I want to hear your stories. Because mathematics isn't just about what happens in classrooms or research labs, it's about the patterns we recognize, the problems we solve, and the insights we develop in our everyday lives." As hands began to rise around the room, Lucia smiled. This was her favorite part of teaching, the moment when people began to recognize the value of their own knowledge, the mathematics they'd been doing all along without naming it as such. "Yes," she said, pointing to a middle-aged woman in the back row, someone who reminded her a bit of herself 3 years ago. "Let's start with you. Tell us about the mathematics in your life."